Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to English 11. Students, today we are going to talk about our students learning outcome of unit number 5 that we are doing, and we are going to talk about read, view and analyze a variety of reading grade appropriate and high interest books and texts from print and non-print sources. And today we are going to focus specifically on poetry. There are different types of poems, different types of poetry. We are going to discuss free verse, narrative and rhythmic poems. And we will touch upon narratives as well. We are going to see an example of fables. And we are going to do these rest of different types of narratives in some other lecture. So this is our students learning outcome of today, and let's focus on the lecture and let's see that how we will achieve this students learning outcome. So be attentive dear learners, and now let's get started with the lecture. Here is your vertical linkage that links your SLO with the previous grade 10. Now students, let's brainstorm. Before moving on to that, what is poetry? Now students, there are different types of texts we are aware of, and one of them is poem or poetry. It is the oldest form of literature that existed in the history. You can find ancient poems, you can find old poems way before prose was there, so there was poetry. And poetry is very much extensive. It is having different types, different forms, different kinds as well. We are going to discuss 3 today. So this is all about poetry. Poetry has rhythm. It is a form of literature that has rhyme scheme, rhythm, but that is not always the case, because we also have free verse poems. And we have narrative poems that tell a story and rhythmic poems that are full of rhythm, rhyme scheme and all those different components of a poem. So there are other kinds and forms as well, like blank verse, there are haiku poems and so many different poems that we use in our English language. Now, what are the key characteristics of each type of poem that we have seen in the students learning outcome? So, what is a free verse poem? What is a narrative poem? And what is a rhythmic poem? Let's get into it. So, students, poetry is the process and poem is the product of poetry, which we have been learning, we have been memorizing them since our smaller grades till now. We have seen poetry on different topics, different themes and so on. So they are a very good form of, a very good way of expressing our thoughts, our ideas, our emotions, inner feelings, and they also have concepts and ideas for readers to understand. And a person who does this is what we call a poet. Now, let's get started with free verse. Students, poem has different lines which we call verse. And when we are talking about free verse, it means that there is no restriction, no hard and fast rule in the free verse kind of poetry. It is free of rhythm. You can write it in a very good flow like a prose without following the strict rules of a poem. So, free verse poem is a very new concept and it's a modern concept. So, it's modern poetry that has no regular pattern of rhythm, rhyme or line length. So, it means that each verse can have a different kind of length, and free verse poems experiment with words to create images for the readers. We use such words in free verse poems that inflict and actually point out some images, convey or send images, pictures in the minds of the reader. So these kind of poems are mostly very compact, easy to understand, and they are very much fun And you can also write a free verse poem because we do not follow the hard and fast rules. Now, let's look at some examples. Here is a free verse poem by Carl Sandburg, and you can notice that we don't have any rhyme scheme. This is a free verse poem. You can see the difference between these different verses in terms of their length. So it reads, "The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on." So you can recite the poem in your own way, and it has to be it has a feeling that it's a free verse poem. So there's liberty, and there is poetic liberty and freedom in such kind of poetry. Now students, even if it's a free verse poem, there has to be a concept, a main idea, or a central point. Here the poet Carl Sandburg is talking about fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So conveying a very basic idea in the free verse kind of poetry, and it usually looks like this. Now there's another poem called William Carlos Williams or Ezra Pound. They are the poets that write free verse or blank verse poetry or imagist poetry. Now, one example is The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. Now, narrative poetry. We know what a narrative is. Narrative, when we talk about it, it has a narrator, and narrative is a story. So just like a short story, it has all the possible components and parts of a story that we incorporate in the poem. Let's see how it goes. A narrative poem is a longer form of poetry that tells an entire story. A narrative, and that's why the name narrative poem. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and an end, just like we have it in a short story or a story in general. Narrative poems contain all of the elements of a fully developed story, including characters. We have characters in our narrative poems, plot, that is the series of events or actions in a very organized manner. We have a conflict or a problem in the narrative poem and resolution as well. Now these poems are typically told by just one narrator or the speaker here. So this is how it is different from a free verse poem. In a free verse poem, you don't tell a story, you rather express your idea, concept, or feeling. But in narrative poems, there has to be a story. So there are a lot of different exciting and interesting narrative poems that you can read, and you can also write your narrative poem in the style of a story. But of course, you can follow a rhyme scheme, you can follow a specific pattern, you can follow the sounds and incorporate those literary or poetic devices that we have studied. For example, personification, imagery, symbolism, and all these things, metaphor, all these things can be incorporated in your narrative poetry. Here is an example. This is a poem by Amy Ludwig van der Water. It's called One Day. It was deep August day on damp creek soil, just me, my sister, and a long roll of foil. I folded tiny shiny chips. He made a long canoe. We built bridges, dams, and docks for our salamander crew. Each salamander silver-sailed, winking in the sun. If I could live one day again, this would be the one. So students, this is an example of a narrative poem. It has a story, it has a plot. So we have the characters, the narrator that is involved in the poem, in the narrative, the sister, and we also have a very good setting. That includes your month and day, damp creek soil. All of these, the description is falling under the setting. So we have characters, now we have a story with a end. So it was a deep August day on Dam Creek soil, just me, my sister, and a long roll of foil. So we have rhyme scheme over here as well. And so it's not a proper rhyme scheme, a proper rhythmic pattern, but we can see a touch of that in this example of narrative poem. So students, this is a narrative poem, totally different from a free verse and a rhythmic poem. It has some elements of rhythm, it has a pattern, but not complete in a complete way. All right. If we talk about rhythmic poem, students, we know what a rhythm is. It is the stressed and unstressed unstressed words that we incorporate in the poem. So it has a rhythm. So there are different rhythms in a poem. Here is an example, and it has a possible rhyming scheme as well. So this is a four verse stanza. The coolness of the night refreshes my skin. The stars shine so bright, causing me to grin. So A and B. So A, B is the rhyme scheme. It has a rhythm. This poem is not like a narrative poem, but it has a rhythm. It has all the possible elements of a poetry, of a normal rhythmic poetry. Now, and you can see that the lines, if we are talking about the verses, they are in the perfect order following the rhyme. So line number 2, verse number 2 is of the same length as verse number 4, and 1 and 2 are of the same length as well. So this is an example of a rhythmic poem with a rhythm, with a rhyme scheme, and with a pattern. Here is another example by William Makepeace Thackeray. This poem is a very good example of a rhythmic poem. First I saw the white bear, then I saw the black. Then I saw the camel with a hump upon his back. Then I saw the grey wolf with mutton in his maw. Then I saw the wombat waddle in the straw. Then I saw the elephant a waving of his trunk. Then I saw the monkey's mercy, how unpleasantly they smelt. So black, back, they are rhyming, maw and straw, trunk and smell. So these are not rhyming right now. Trunk and smelt. A, B, C, D is the rhyme scheme over here. So this is an example of a rhythmic poem. It has a rhythm. If you read it aloud, you can feel a musicality, a rhythm of a song in the poem. So our rhythmic poems have very good and complete length, and also rhyme scheme as well. So as the difference is clear between a free verse, narrative, and rhythmic poem. Here is an example of a very famous poem called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So cloud, crowd, hills, daffodils, they are rhyming, trees and breeze. So we have the rhyming scheme A, B, C, C. And throughout the other stanzas, the poet follows the same kind of rhyme scheme, A, B, C, C. In stanza 1, 2 and 3, we have the same rhyming scheme. So it means we have a rhythm, and this is categorized as a rhythmic poem. Does it have a story? Yes, a kind of, not exactly a story, but an experience, an observation, and also expression of a memory, a very happy memory or thought or idea that the poet has over here. Now, students, covering all these different poems, the SLO that we have is read the appropriate grade level poems. And in that, we talked about what is a free verse. As suggested by the name, it's free of any hard and fast rules. And then we have our narrative poems that we have just saw with an example, and then rhythmic poems. Now, the second part of the learning outcome that talks about prose. And we know that prose are the opposite of poetry. So poetry and prose, these are two different text types. Poetry is in a specific format and prose is just like we write our normal text. This is what we call prose. Over here we have a type of narrative, a type of prose called fable. Now fable are these short folk kind of tales that are transferred generation to generation. Now here is a story, a fable called The Goose That Laid Golden Eggs. There was a man who had a goose that always laid golden eggs, one every day in the year. Now he thought there must be gold inside of her. So he wrung her neck and laid her open. He found that she was exactly like all other geese. He thought to find riches and lost the little he had. Now this is the fable that gives a very good moral lesson, ethical lesson, and a very good message so that we can learn from them. And there are hundreds of other fables that are famous and they are read by English readers all over the world. This fable teaches that one should be content or happy with what one has and not be greedy. So this man became greedy and tried to rip open the goose but didn't find anything. Only if he waited, that process would have been lasted longer, but since he opened that goose and he tried to look inside, he lost whatever little he had and he lost the goose in the process. So this is what we call a fable. Now there is a legendary ancient writer, Aesop. So you have Aesop's fables. You can find the PDF and you can read hundreds of fables that are famous. Another example is The Hare and the Tortoise, the greedy dog, the clever fox. All these are fables with good messages that can shape our morals and give us valuable lessons that we should include in our life. Now students, since we have talked about all these two things mentioned in the students' learning outcome, you have a live worksheet link over here that you can actually access easily and solve the live worksheet. For another worksheet, we have free verse and narrative poems. First, you are introduced about these and then you are asked to actually write free verse and narrative poem. It's very easy. Just take any experience of your life, write it in a narrative form following a rhythm. And if you want to write a free verse, it is very easy to write a free verse poem because there are no rules and you can easily write one. Now, students, for the homework, you have to identify what type of poem is it. Is it a free verse poem? Is it a narrative poem? Or is it a rhythmic poem? And now it's your turn to find out about the type of this poem. And then you can give your explanation that why do you think so, why is it a free verse, why it's a narrative, or why it's a rhythmic poem. This is your homework, followed by your worksheets. All these resources that are mentioned, you'll get your worksheet, skill sheet, and a presentation. This PowerPoint presentation will be available. Try to memorize the definitions of these different types of poetry, compare them with examples as we have seen, and then also talk about prose where we discussed fables. Next time in one of our next lectures, we will talk about legends, myths, folk tales, fairy tales, and all those things that are mentioned. So for today's lecture, this is all about it. Now students, it's time for you to practice them. Read as much poetry as you can, identify the different types So there are blank verse, there are haiku poems, the Japanese style poems, and there are sequence and so many other poetry forms or types that are waiting for you to discover them. So discover as many different types of poetry as you can for additional and extra information. Students, I will see you in the next video lesson. I hope that we have covered our students' learning outcome for today. I'll see you in the next video lesson. Till then, take care of yourselves and Allah Hafiz.